There's a secret history written not in ink, but in footsteps, paths carved by the daring, the desperate, and the defiant. Picture a moonlit trail snaking through a mountain pass, where every shadow could hide a smuggler's pack or a king's soldier. These hidden routes, woven like threads through the fabric of medieval Europe and beyond, tell a story that official records never could, because while kings and emperors drew bold lines on maps, declaring where their power began and ended, the real borders were shaped by something far more powerful: the movement of people who refused to be bound by them. Think about the last time you saw a map of an ancient kingdom, those neat, colorful shapes suggesting clear control and order. But what if those borders were more like suggestions than rules? That's exactly what smugglers' routes reveal. From the salt traders slipping through alpine valleys to the merchants dodging taxes along the Silk Road, these clandestine networks expose the cracks in royal authority. They show us where kingdoms were strong and where they were surprisingly weak, because when smugglers repeatedly crossed a so-called border without fear, it wasn't just a path they were following. It was a truth. Power wasn't absolute. It ebbed and flowed like the tides, and these hidden trails were the currents that carried the real story. So why does this matter today? Because history isn't just about kings and battles. It's about the everyday people who navigated the spaces in between. Smugglers weren't just breaking laws, they were revealing the unspoken rules of their world. Their routes became invisible highways of resistance, survival, and even innovation, connecting cultures and economies in ways that official diplomacy never could. And as we trace their footsteps, we'll uncover something extraordinary: the true shape of the past, drawn not by crowns but by courage, ready to step off the map and into history's hidden corridors. Let's begin. If you look at a modern map, borders are sharp, unyielding lines, clear declarations of who controls what. But travel back to the medieval world, and those lines blur into something far more fluid. Ancient kingdoms didn't have satellites or GPS to mark their territories with precision. Instead, their borders were living, breathing things, shaped by the lay of the land, the will of local communities, and the quiet defiance of those who moved through the cracks. Take the Rhine River, for example. To a Frankish king, it might have been the official boundary of his realm, but to the fishermen hauling in their nets or the merchants floating cargo downstream, it was just another watery highway, one that paid little attention to royal decrees. Geography played a huge role in these unofficial borders. Mountains like the Pyrenees or the Carpathians were natural barriers, but they were also riddled with hidden passes and shepherds' trails. A tax collector might never dare climb those heights, but a smuggler with a mule train knew every switchback, and it wasn't just terrain. Culture and trade shaped these invisible frontiers too. A village on the edge of two kingdoms might speak both languages, trade with both sides, and swear vague oaths to distant rulers while living by its own rules. Official maps might color that village as part of one kingdom, but the people who lived there knew better. Their loyalties and their livelihoods stretched across the lines on parchment. This gap between royal claims and real control is where smugglers thrived. When a Venetian merchant bypassed Byzantine customs by slipping through a backcountry route, or when Welsh wool made its way into England without paying tolls, they weren't just cheating the system. They were proving that borders were more idea than ironclad fact. Kings might declare a valley theirs, but if their soldiers couldn't patrol it and their taxmen couldn't reach it, did it really belong to them? The answer was written in the footsteps of those who moved freely where authority faltered. These hidden routes didn't just carry goods, they carried truths about where power really ended and where the wild, untamed edges of the world began. To call smugglers mere criminals would be to miss their real historical significance. They were economic opportunists, cultural bridge builders, and sometimes even unwitting cartographers of the medieval world's hidden geography. Consider the salt smugglers of 12th century Burgundy. While French kings imposed heavy taxes on this precious commodity, entire villages in the Jura Mountains built their livelihoods on moving it through secret forest trails. These weren't just acts of rebellion, they were evidence of a thriving underground economy that official records ignored. The salt didn't vanish, it simply flowed where the crown's grip was weakest, revealing pockets of autonomy within supposedly unified kingdoms. What's fascinating is how these networks expose the fault lines between royal ambition and local reality. Take the case of the Scottish Highlands, where clan leaders maintained elaborate smuggling routes for wool and wine right under the noses of English tax collectors. The rugged terrain wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a political one, creating spaces where Edinburgh's authority meant little. When Highlanders traded illicitly with French merchants or Dutch buyers, they weren't just dodging taxes. They were participating in an alternative system of power, one where kinship ties and geographic knowledge trumped distant royal decrees. These shadow economies also reveal unexpected cultural connections. Along the Danube, Jewish and Armenian merchants developed intricate smuggling networks that bypassed Byzantine and Hungarian toll stations. Their routes became conduits not just for goods but for ideas, medical knowledge from Persia, musical instruments from Al-Andalus, even new farming techniques. While kings waged wars over borders, these unofficial traders were weaving a web of exchange that transcended political divisions. The goods they moved tell us what people truly valued when no one was watching. Spices for flavoring dull diets, dyes for vibrant clothing, books forbidden by censors. Perhaps most revealing is how smugglers forced kingdoms to adapt. When Venetian customs records show repeated crackdowns on the same Dalmatian coastal routes, it's not just a story of crime, it's proof that maritime borders were porous. The Adriatic wasn't fully Venice's to control, no matter what their maps claimed. Over time, some rulers pragmatically turned a blind eye to certain smuggling activities, recognizing that heavy-handed enforcement could spark revolts. In doing so, they tacitly admitted what smugglers had always known. Real power wasn't about drawing lines on parchment, but about understanding where those lines could be bent or ignored altogether. The legacy of these networks lingers in surprising ways. Modern historians tracing medieval toll records often find curious gaps, towns that should have been bustling trade hubs but show minimal official activity. The explanation: these were likely smuggling centers thriving in the shadows. By reading against the grain of official documents, we can reconstruct these hidden geographies. It's a reminder that history isn't just written by the victors sometimes, it's whispered by those who slipped through the cracks. High in the Alpine passes where icy winds cut like knives and sheer drops could swallow a careless step, an invisible economy thrived, one built on the white gold of the medieval world, salt. More than just a seasoning, salt preserved food, healed wounds, and even served as currency in some regions. But with such value came heavy taxes, imposed by lords and kingdoms eager to line their coffers. That's where the smugglers came in. These daring runners knew every crevice of the mountains, weaving paths so treacherous that tax collectors wouldn't dare follow. Their routes weren't just shortcuts, they were acts of defiance, proving that even the mightiest rulers couldn't fully control the rugged heart of the Alps. Take the Simplon Pass, straddling what's now Switzerland and Italy. Officially, it belonged to the Duchy of Savoy, but in practice, the salt carriers who navigated its switchbacks owed allegiance to no one. They moved under cover of fog, their mules laden with contraband salt from mines like those at Hallstatt or Berchtesgaden. What's remarkable is how these trails ignored political boundaries altogether. A smuggler might start in Austrian lands, skirt through a slice of territory claimed by Milan, and end in a Swiss village, all in a single night's journey. The mountains didn't care about royal decrees, and neither did the people who knew their secrets. But this wasn't just about evasion. The salt trade knit together communities that official power structures had left isolated. High-altitude villages, cut off from lowland markets by snow for half the year, relied on smugglers not just for salt but for news, tools, and even marriage matches. In places like the Valais or the Tyrol, dialects and traditions blended along these illicit routes, creating cultural ties that outlasted the kingdoms trying to tax them. A farmer in Savoy might trade cheese for salt with a German-speaking herder, their barter sealed with a handshake, no toll booth required. The lords weren't blind to this, of course. Records from the 14th century show repeated and largely failed crackdowns. One Savoyard count even stationed guards at a key pass, only to find the smugglers had simply shifted to a higher, more dangerous path. That's the irony. The steeper the taxes, the more ingenious the workarounds became. Some runners hollowed out logs to hide salt, while others trained dogs to carry small loads through unpatrolled gullies. Every attempt to tighten control revealed just how porous these so-called borders really were. What makes the Alpine salt routes so telling is how they turned geography into power. The same peaks that made the region hard to govern also made it a smuggler's paradise. Unlike open plains where cavalry could chase down trespassers, the Alps offered endless hideouts and alternate paths. When a snowstorm could erase a trail in minutes, or a rockslide could block a king's road for months, local knowledge trumped royal authority. The salt smugglers didn't just exploit this, they embodied it. Their footsteps traced the real map of the Alps, one where usefulness and survival mattered far more than lines on a parchment. By the time large states like Switzerland or France consolidated control centuries later, the old smuggling networks had already shaped the region's identity. Many of today's hiking trails follow those same clandestine routes, a reminder that borders aren't just drawn by conquerors, they're worn into the land by the people who live there. The next time you see a picturesque alpine valley, remember, beneath the postcard views lies a history written in salt and defiance, where every hidden path whispers the same truth. Power isn't just about who claims the land, it's about who really knows how to move through it. The Silk Road wasn't just a single, shining highway of commerce, it had a shadowy twin, a network of hidden trails where smugglers moved like ghosts under the noses of empires. While official caravans lumbered through fortified gates, paying heavy tariffs at every checkpoint, these covert operators slipped through the gaps, revealing the soft underbelly of imperial control. Where the main routes hugged oases and garrison towns, smugglers carved paths through the Taklamakan's shifting dunes or the Pamir's razor-edged passes, places so harsh that even the mightiest armies hesitated to follow. Consider the case of the Sogdians, those master traders of Central Asia. While their official caravans carried silks and spices with royal permits, their secret counterparts moved something far more dangerous: ideas. Buddhist sutras banned by the Tang dynasty, Nestorian Christian texts frowned upon in Persia, even Zoroastrian fire rituals suppressed by Arab conquerors, all found their way along these underground channels. The very goods empires tried hardest to control became the ones most likely to vanish into the shadows, proving that censorship was often an illusion. A merchant might be searched at a checkpoint, but who could stop a scroll hidden inside a bale of cotton, or a tiny gospel sewn into the lining of a saddlebag? Weapons, too, flowed through these unofficial channels. The Romans strictly controlled the export of steel, fearing its use against their legions. Yet Persian smiths somehow acquired Roman blades, while steppe nomads got their hands on Chinese crossbow mechanisms. How? Through networks of middlemen who knew which officials could be bribed, which mountain passes were unguarded, and which desert wells were too remote for patrols. These weren't just economic transactions, they were acts of geopolitical subversion, showing that even superpowers couldn't seal their borders completely. What's fascinating is how these shadow routes mirrored and sometimes outlasted the official ones. When the Tibetan Empire blockaded China's western frontier in the 8th century, the main Silk Road faltered. But smugglers simply shifted to the southern route, threading through the Karakoram's icy defiles. Centuries later, when Mongol conquests reopened the highways, these secondary trails didn't disappear. They became insurance policies ready to reactivate whenever politics turned volatile. The real lesson here: trade isn't just about permission, it's about ingenuity. A smuggler navigating the Kizil-Kum desert wasn't just avoiding taxes. He was proving that human connection could outmaneuver even the most elaborate border controls. The goods that moved secretly, whether incense censored by caliphs or jade reserved for Chinese emperors, tell us what people valued enough to risk their lives for. And in doing so, they drew the true map of the Silk Road, one where culture and commerce refused to be fenced in. The Mediterranean's sparkling waters hid a secret. For all the grand claims of empires, the sea belonged to those who dared to defy them. Venice might declare itself queen of the Adriatic, and Byzantium might boast control of the Aegean, but pirates and smugglers knew better. Their ships darted between islands and coves, slipping past imperial fleets with practiced ease. These weren't just criminals, they were the cartographers of a hidden map, one where power dissolved into the waves. Take the case of the Dalmatian coast, a labyrinth of inlets and rocky outcrops perfect for evasion. Official Venetian records bristle with frustration. No matter how many galleys they stationed at key ports, cargoes of Anatolian grain or Egyptian spices kept appearing in markets without paying duties. The reason? A chain of unofficial harbors, some no more than crescent-shaped beaches where local fishermen moonlighted as middlemen. A smuggler's ship might drop anchor at midnight, unload its goods onto rowboats, and vanish before dawn, leaving no trace but footprints in the sand. These phantom ports thrived because they answered a simple truth: people needed trade more than empires needed control. Piracy, often indistinguishable from smuggling, exposed another flaw in maritime borders. The Uskoks of Senj, a motley band of refugees and renegades, turned the Adriatic into their playground. Hiding in the maze of channels near modern-day Croatia, they preyed on Venetian and Ottoman ships alike, selling their plunder in free ports like Ragusa. What's revealing isn't just their audacity, it's how long they flourished. Despite repeated crackdowns, the Uskoks survived for decades, proving that even the mightiest navies couldn't police every mile of coastline. The sea was too vast, the hiding places too numerous. The goods moving through these networks tell their own story. Silk from Persia, wax from North Africa, even enslaved people trafficked past papal bans, all flowed through the Mediterranean's cracks. But perhaps the most subversive cargo was knowledge. Arab medical texts smuggled into Christian Europe via Sicilian intermediaries quietly revolutionized medicine. Greek philosophy, preserved in Byzantine monasteries, reached Italian scholars through shady middlemen in Cyprus. Empires might draw lines on maps, but ideas refused to stay within them. What made maritime smuggling so resilient? Geography played a starring role. Unlike land borders where a castle or wall could block passage, water was fluid in every sense. A smuggler's galley could change course with the wind, ducking behind an island or blending into fishing fleets. Weather became an ally, storms scattered patrols while fog provided cover. And let's not forget the complicity of coastal communities. A village might officially swear loyalty to Venice while its fishermen guided smuggled goods ashore by night. Survival often trumped sovereignty. The real irony, some of history's most celebrated ports began as smuggling hubs. Famagusta in Cyprus, later a glittering trade center, first grew because its hidden coves let merchants bypass Byzantine taxes. Even Venice itself, that paragon of maritime order, got its start as a refuge for those fleeing mainland authority. The lesson is clear: the sea doesn't obey kings. It obeys those who understand its rhythms, its dangers, and its endless possibilities. The next time you see a map of medieval empires, remember, the bold colors claiming control were just wishes. The real borders were written in wake trails and moonlit sails where power ebbed with the tide. In the quiet villages tucked between mountain ranges and along forgotten coastlines, an unspoken rule bound communities together. Silence was survival. When a smuggler's mule train wound through a hamlet at midnight, no one asked questions. The baker might leave a loaf by his back door. The miller's son could guide the group past a treacherous ravine. These weren't just acts of complicity, they were a quiet rebellion against distant rulers who treated borders as lines to be drawn, not lived. Local knowledge turned geography into a weapon against central control. Take the shepherds of the Pyrenees who moved flocks between France and Spain with the seasons. To kings, these peaks were a border, to the herders, just another pasture. Their secret trails, worn smooth by generations of hoofbeats, became smuggling highways for wool, wine, and even forbidden books. Tax collectors couldn't follow paths that didn't appear on maps, and soldiers who dared venture into the high passes often found themselves lost, or conveniently misdirected by helpful villagers offering wrong directions. The economic stakes were personal. When a kingdom like Castile imposed crushing taxes on Andalusian olive oil, entire villages in the Alpujarras Mountains pivoted to smuggling. A farmer might spend his days tending groves legally, then by night help haul untaxed barrels through dry riverbeds to Granada's underground markets. This wasn't just about profit, it was about survival. A single confiscated cargo could ruin a family, so communities developed elaborate warning systems. Bonfires on hillsides, coded messages woven into laundry hung out to dry. Resistance wasn't dramatic, it was woven into the fabric of daily life. Some of the most ingenious collaborators were the women history books overlook. In the Scottish Highlands, distillers' wives hid illicit whiskey in false-bottomed butter churns, while along the Baltic coast, fishermen's daughters smuggled Prussian linen disguised as wedding dowries. Their participation reveals something vital. Smuggling wasn't a fringe activity. It was a community enterprise where everyone from grandmothers to goose herders played a role. When authorities searched a house, they'd often find nothing, not because goods were well hidden, but because neighbors had spirited them away through backyard tunnels or cellar networks. The longevity of these networks is perhaps their most damning critique of centralized power. While kingdoms rose and fell, the salt routes of the Alps and the wool trails of Wales persisted for centuries. Why? Because they served real needs, not abstract political designs. A Breton lacemaker selling her wares in Normandy without paying French tariffs wasn't making a philosophical statement, she was feeding her children. And when the same evasion methods worked under Plantagenet, Valois, and Bourbon rulers alike, it proved something profound. Borders might change on parchment, but the land's logic endured. Even religion could bend to smuggling's pragmatism. In 16th century Transylvania, Lutheran miners, Orthodox woodcutters, and Catholic innkeepers, groups often at odds, collaborated to move Hungarian silver past Habsburg agents. Shared economic interests erased sectarian divides, creating alliances that official power structures never anticipated. The real borders weren't between faiths, but between those who profited from the system and those who subverted it. What emerges from these stories isn't a tale of lawlessness, but of alternative order. Villages developed their own codes of conduct, punishing those who broke the smugglers' trust while rewarding cleverness. A Swiss chronicle from 1483 recounts how a man who betrayed a salt caravan was ostracized, his fields left unplowed, his daughters unmarried. The message was clear: loyalty to the community outweighed loyalty to far-off kings. These grassroots networks force us to rethink how we map history. Official documents might show a kingdom's reach, but the real boundaries of power lie in the spaces where tax rolls go blank, where customs records show suspiciously low traffic, where the same remote valley appears in court cases for generations as a problem area. The land itself remembers what parchment forgets, that control was always negotiable, and that the people who knew the earth's contours held the true power to open or close the gates. Taxes were the lifeblood of medieval kingdoms, or at least that's what rulers believed. But for every ducat collected at a toll booth, another slipped through the cracks, carried by merchants who knew the backroads better than the king's own taxmen. Take the bustling trade city of Bruges, where official records show a steady flow of Flemish wool into France. What those records don't reveal, the countless bales that vanished into the marshes of the Zwin estuary, floated on rafts under cover of darkness to avoid the Count of Flanders' hefty export duties. This wasn't just petty theft, it was a direct strike at the crown's ability to fund its armies, build its castles, and project its power. The sheer creativity of evasion methods exposed the limits of royal reach. In the wine country of Bordeaux, barrels bound for England were famously leaky, not by accident but by design. Merchants would soak the wood so it swelled just enough to underreport the contents, while coopers perfected the art of crafting false bottoms for extra concealment. Over in the Holy Roman Empire, entire ghost markets sprang up just beyond city walls, where goods changed hands without ever triggering gate tolls. These weren't shadowy back alleys, but thriving, open-air exchanges where everyone from nobles to nuns turned a blind eye, proving that tax avoidance was often a communal act, not a solitary crime. Kings responded with increasingly elaborate bureaucracy, but the results were laughably ineffective. England's 15th century customs system required every cargo ship to carry detailed manifests sealed by local officials. Yet Venetian galley captains routinely listed spices as dried fish to pay lower rates, while Hanseatic traders exploited loopholes by declaring goods in transit only to accidentally offload them at the first port. The more rules piled up, the more smugglers treated them like obstacles in a game, finding workarounds faster than clerks could write new decrees. What's fascinating is how these struggles forced rulers to compromise. When King Louis Roman XI of France discovered entire provinces ignoring his salt tax, he didn't send more soldiers. He cut deals with local lords, offering them a share of revenues in exchange for enforcement. Along the Rhine, toll stations gradually shifted from rigid checkpoints to negotiated stops, where merchants haggled rates based on what the traffic would bear. Even the mighty Venetian Republic, which kept meticulous ledgers of every pepper sack entering its ports, quietly tolerated small-scale smuggling rather than risk alienating the traders who filled its coffers. The real lesson here isn't about law-breaking, it's about the tension between ambition and reality. A king could claim sovereignty over a river, but if boatmen routinely bypassed his toll booths by dragging vessels overland at shallow fords, how much control did he truly have? Tax rolls from places like medieval York show curious dips in revenue whenever royal oversight weakened, suggesting that compliance depended less on loyalty than on the likelihood of getting caught. Perhaps the most telling evidence comes from the artifacts themselves. Archaeologists excavating medieval ports frequently find trick items, hollowed-out loaves of bread hiding silver coins, double-walled jugs concealing saffron, even fake wine barrels with compartments for untaxed goods. These weren't the tools of professional criminals, but everyday people responding to impossible demands. When the difference between feeding your family and starvation was one extra tax, morality looked very different than it did in royal courts. By tracing these evasion patterns, we're not just following smugglers, we're mapping the invisible fissures in medieval power. Every diverted trail, every lost cargo, every bribed official whispers the same truth. Borders weren't lines on a map, but ongoing negotiations between those who made the rules and those who lived under them. And in that endless dance, the state's reach was always shorter than its grasp. Under the cover of darkness, a bundle wrapped in oilcloth changes hands in a Burgundian forest. Not silk or spices inside, but pages that could get a man burned. This was the dangerous trade in forbidden texts, where smugglers became unsung librarians of the medieval world. While kings and bishops proclaimed religious unity, these covert networks proved how fragile that control really was. A Cathar scripture hidden in a wine barrel, a Quran disguised as a Christian psalter, even scientific treatises banned by the church, all moved along the same shadowy routes that carried salt and silver. The Albigensian Crusade in 13th century France offers a stark example. As church authorities razed Cathar strongholds, survivors smuggled their dualist teachings out in the linings of merchants' cloaks or hollowed-out pilgrim staffs. Some texts resurfaced decades later in Lombardy, where tolerant city-states gave them refuge. This wasn't just about preserving heresy, it revealed the porousness of doctrinal borders. A bishop might ban a book in Paris, but in the freewheeling trade hubs of northern Italy, ideas circulated as freely as Florentine gold. Islamic Spain tells a parallel story. When the Reconquista tightened, Jewish and Muslim scholars risked their lives to smuggle Arabic manuscripts out of Cordoba, works on medicine, astronomy, and philosophy that Christian Europe would later claim as its own Renaissance foundation. The routes they used, often the same goat tracks that moved Andalusian saffron to Castilian markets. Knowledge didn't respect the lines between faiths any more than spices did. Protestant reformers exploited these networks brilliantly. Martin Luther's pamphlets, banned across Catholic Europe, spread like wildfire via linen merchants' secret compartments and fishmongers' false-bottomed carts. In Antwerp, a single underground print shop could produce thousands of illicit tracts, smuggled into England inside shipments of Flemish tapestry. The church's index of forbidden books became, ironically, a smuggler's shopping list. The more a text was banned, the more urgently it was sought. Nor was this trade one-directional. Eastern Orthodox monks sneaked Greek patristic writings into Venice, where they influenced Catholic theologians. Kabbalistic texts from Toledo found their way to Jewish scholars in Provence through networks of spice traders. Even within Islam, Sufi poetry condemned by caliphs traveled along the Silk Road in saddlebags meant for lapis lazuli. Every major faith had its underground river of dissent, flowing through the cracks in orthodoxy. The real map of medieval religious thought isn't found in cathedral archives or papal decrees, it's etched in the footnotes of surviving manuscripts. Marginal notes in a rescued Cathar text might thank an anonymous merchant of Lyon for its preservation. A Quran copied in secret bears water stains from a Danube crossing. These material traces tell us where authority was absolute and where it was performative. A bishop could order a book burning in the town square, but if the same text kept appearing in village markets 2 valleys over, his power had limits. What makes this intellectual smuggling so transformative is how it reshaped entire movements. The Hussite Reformation in Bohemia drew strength from Wycliffe's banned works, smuggled out of Oxford in shipments of English wool. Without these covert pipelines, the Protestant Reformation might have remained a local dispute rather than a continent-wide upheaval. Ideas, it turns out, are the ultimate contraband, light enough to carry, potent enough to topple kingdoms. The next time you see a medieval illuminated manuscript in a museum, look closer. That ornate border might hide palimpsest, scraped away texts beneath the approved ones. The binding could conceal fragments of a forbidden gospel. Even the pigments might tell a story. Lapis from Afghanistan, gold leaf from Mali, all traded by the same networks that moved heresies under the radar. The real borders of faith weren't drawn in ink, but in the daring of those who refused to let knowledge be caged. Court records from medieval Europe are full of frustrated officials complaining about the same problem roads that shouldn't exist, yet somehow carried thriving traffic. A tax collector in 14th century Toulouse might log a barren mountain pass as impassable, only for local shepherds to testify years later about guiding mule trains through it every week. These contradictions aren't just bureaucratic slip-ups, they're breadcrumbs leading us to the real map of the past. Modern historians have learned to read between the lines of these documents, piecing together smuggler routes like detectives, reconstructing a crime scene from scattered clues. Take the case of the Thuringian Forest in Germany. Official maps from the Holy Roman Empire show it as a dense, unbroken wilderness separating Saxon and Frankish territories. But dig into court cases from the period and a different picture emerges. Repeated prosecutions for toll evasion describe merchants cutting through the forest using the charcoal burner's path or the salt drift. Archaeologists following these leads have found physical evidence: worn stepping stones, makeshift bridges over streams, even hidden waymarkers carved into trees. Suddenly, that impassable forest becomes a busy corridor, its existence deliberately erased from official records to hide the gap between imperial claims and reality. Folklore is another goldmine for these hidden geographies. Breton ballads about the moonlit road where no tacksman treads, or Swiss legends of the Devil's Causeway that bypassed Habsburg checkpoints often contain kernels of truth. Ethnographers working in the Pyrenees have matched oral traditions about smugglers' trails to actual footpaths still used by shepherds today. One particularly vivid Catalan tale describes a smuggler escaping soldiers by vanishing into a waterfall. Historians later found a concealed cave system behind the cascade, complete with 16th century graffiti and rusted blade fragments. Stories, it turns out, can be waypoints on a map nobody dared to draw. The real power of this approach shines when we overlay these reconstructed routes with political maps. The contrast is staggering. What kings claimed as solid blocks of territory often resemble Swiss cheese upon closer inspection, pierced with unofficial corridors where authority dissolved. The Duchy of Burgundy's official borders in the 1400s looked imposing on parchment, but smugglers' trails reveal a patchwork of enclaves and bypasses. Wine merchants could travel from Beaune to Ghent without once crossing land where the Duke's tax collectors held sway. These weren't just shortcuts, they were proof that sovereignty was negotiable. Archaeology adds another layer to this hidden cartography. In the Scottish Highlands, teams using LiDAR technology have discovered entire ghost roads beneath the heather, packed trails worn deep by centuries of illicit cattle drives, invisible from ground level. Similar finds in the Apennines show how smuggler paths often followed prehistoric trade routes, proving that some networks outlasted empires. Even shipwrecks tell part of the story. A Venetian galley sunk off the Dalmatian coast was found carrying contraband Byzantine icons beneath a legitimate cargo of grain, its secret compartments perfectly preserved by the Adriatic's salty embrace. What emerges isn't just a collection of interesting anomalies, but a fundamental challenge to how we understand medieval power. Borders weren't static lines, they were constantly shifting zones of control and evasion, where local knowledge trumped royal decrees. The next time you see a medieval map with its bold colors and clear divisions, remember, those tidy shapes are fantasies. The real map was drawn in footsteps and hoofprints, in whispered directions and moonlit rendezvous, by people who understood that the land belonged to those who knew how to move through it. At the heart of every smuggling operation lay a simple equation. How much were people willing to pay to bypass the rules? A pound of pepper that sold for 10 ducats in Venice could fetch 20 in Munich if it slipped past Habsburg customs, enough to make even cautious merchants consider the gamble. But this wasn't just about greed, it was about necessity. When kingdoms like France imposed salt taxes so steep they doubled the price, entire regions faced starvation, not from lack of food, but from lacking the means to preserve it. Smugglers didn't create this desperation. They exploited the cracks in systems that created it. The markup on contraband goods followed predictable patterns. Luxuries like silk or spices carried the fattest premiums precisely because their buyers were wealthy enough to absorb the risk. But bulk commodities told a more revealing story. The fact that humble Baltic grain routinely flowed illegally into Norway reveals a harsh truth. Even staple foods became unaffordable under heavy tariffs. Archaeologists find evidence of this in shipwrecks, ordinary barrels stamped with false origins, or grain mixed with chaff to bulk up untaxed portions. These weren't tricks of high-stakes profiteers, but survival strategies for communities priced out of their own markets. Risk shaped every link in the chain. A Venetian glassblower smuggling mirrors to Egypt might triple his money, but only if he avoided the Mamluk Sultan's inspectors, who were known to impound entire cargoes and imprison crews. So smugglers developed intricate insurance systems centuries before Lloyd's of London. Jewish merchants in Alexandria often advanced funds to caravan leaders, with contracts stipulating higher interest rates for riskier routes. If the goods arrived safely, both parties profited handsomely. If not, the loss was shared, spreading the danger across networks instead of individuals. What's striking is how these shadow markets mirrored and sometimes outpaced official economies. In 15th century Lyon, records show more English wool changing hands in clandestine warehouses than at the sanctioned fairgrounds. Authorities knew it, they simply couldn't stop it. The demand for quality fleece among Flemish weavers outweighed any fear of punishment. Similarly, when the Papal States banned exports of alum, a vital dye fixative to pressure rival textile cities, Genoese smugglers simply rerouted shipments through Corsica. Within months, Florentine dyers had their supply back, proving that economic gravity always trumped political decrees. The calculus of risk versus reward created some astonishing innovations. In the Alps, smugglers used hollowed-out logs as makeshift pipelines to funnel salt across ridges undetected. Along the Loire, wine merchants developed a lexicon of barrel markings, a scratch here, a stain there, to signal which vessels held taxable goods and which hid contraband beneath false bottoms. Even the church got involved, with some abbeys near the Swiss border donating salt to sister monasteries conveniently located just beyond tax jurisdictions. These adaptations expose a fundamental flaw in medieval governance. Kingdoms treated trade as something to be controlled, not facilitated. When Catalan merchants started smuggling Sicilian grain during shortages, it wasn't because they loved breaking laws. It was because Barcelona's official supply chains failed to meet demand. The same pattern repeated from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Wherever bureaucracies created artificial scarcity, black markets flourished to correct the imbalance. Perhaps the most telling detail comes from toll records themselves. In busy ports like Marseille or Hamburg, customs officials often underreported seizures, fearing their superiors would punish them for admitting how much slipped through. The very systems designed to enforce control were quietly admitting defeat, proving that no amount of royal proclamations could outweigh the oldest law of all, supply and demand. Borderlands have always been places of paradox, officially the fringes of power, yet often the beating heart of underground economies. Take the marshes of Flanders, where reeds grew taller than a man and waterways shifted with the tides. To Count Baldwin of Flanders, this was wasteland too wet for farming, too treacherous for armies. But to the salt smugglers who poled their flat-bottomed boats through its labyrinth of channels, it was a paradise. They moved untaxed goods from Bruges to France with impunity, hidden by fog and the sheer indifference of rulers who saw swamps as empty space. The land itself became an accomplice, swallowing patrols in its quicksands while guiding smugglers with secret markers, a bent willow here, a notch in a stump there. Mountain ranges played a similar role. The Carpathians, stretching like a spine across Eastern Europe, were nominally controlled by the Kingdom of Hungary. Yet in the high valleys, shepherds speaking a dozen languages traded wool, wax, and silver with little regard for borders. When Hungarian tax collectors ventured up from the plains, they found villages where tax records were carved on notched sticks, a system so localized that royal clerks couldn't decipher it. These weren't lawless zones, they operated under their own rules, where a smuggler's promise carried more weight than a king's seal. Forests, too, became arteries of defiance. The Black Forest in Germany was so dense that timber smugglers could drag entire logs to the Rhine without ever crossing a road. Local woodcutters developed a coded language of axe blazes to mark safe routes, while charcoal burners acted as lookouts, their fires signaling when patrols were near. What made these woodlands so potent wasn't just their cover, it was how they turned isolation into advantage. A royal forester might control the official highways, but the deep woods belonged to those who knew their secrets. Even coasts functioned as borderlands. The Wadden Sea, a vast tidal flat between Denmark and the Low Countries, was impossible to govern by conventional means. Ships ran aground with the tides, their crews wading ashore with cargoes of Scottish wool or Norwegian timber, leaving no port records behind. Fishermen doubled as guides, memorizing channels that changed daily with the sands. To authorities, these shallows were navigational hazards. To smugglers, they were the perfect loophole, a space where maps ceased to matter. What united all these landscapes was their marginality. Rulers saw them as empty, useless, or too costly to control, blind spots where their power faded into theory. But for the people who lived there, these edges were centers. The alpine farmer grazing his cows on both sides of a pass, the Fenland fisher selling eels in 3 different markets without paying tolls, the Basque whalers who traded with Normans and Gascons alike. They weren't just exploiting gaps in the system. They were proving that the strongest borders weren't drawn by crowns, but by communities who turned geography into autonomy. The irony, many of these lawless zones were far more organized than the kingdoms surrounding them. Smugglers in the Pyrenees held annual gatherings to set prices and resolve disputes, while Baltic timber runners maintained strict codes about which trees could be felled and which protected as trail markers. These weren't anarchic free-for-alls, they were alternative systems of governance, thriving where centralized authority withered. Archaeology bears this out. Excavations in the Dordogne reveal cave systems repurposed as smuggling storerooms, with ventilation shafts and hidden exits. In the Apennines, researchers have found way station taverns built into cliff faces, their cellars stocked with contraband wine jars centuries old. Even the peat bogs of Ireland yield surprises: leather satchels stuffed with untaxed silver, preserved like time capsules of defiance. These borderlands force us to rethink medieval power not as a radiating glow from castles and capitals, but as a patchwork of light and shadow. The next time you see a map of feudal Europe, don't focus on the bold lines marking kingdoms. Look instead for the blank spaces between them. There, in the marshes and mountains, the real story was being written by footsteps, not decrees. The moonlit docks of medieval Genoa tell a silent story, one where velvet-clad merchants checked cargo manifests by lantern light, while armed guards pretended not to notice the unmarked barrels being loaded below deck. This wasn't the work of desperate outlaws, but of respected guildmasters and minor nobles who saw smuggling not as crime, but as commerce by other means. The social ladder of illicit trade had rungs reaching far higher than we often imagine. Take the case of the Fugger family, those banking titans of Augsburg. While their ledgers boasted legitimate loans to emperors, their ships routinely carried contraband Hungarian copper past Venetian customs, protected not by stealth, but by carefully cultivated friendships with port officials. Even clergy played the game. Monasteries along the Rhine famously produced some of Europe's finest wines, and many abbots proved equally skilled at bypassing export taxes. Records from Burgundy show Cistercian brothers transporting barrels hidden under loads of sacred relics, their clerical robes ensuring inspection-free passage. One bishop in Normandy went further, using his private fleet to smuggle English wool directly to Flemish weavers, all while publicly condemning the very trade that lined his cathedral's coffers. The aristocracy's involvement reveals smuggling's open secret. Legality often depended on who you were, not what you did. A poor salt carrier caught with untaxed goods might lose his hand, while a count's agent moving the same cargo would receive a discreet fine, if anything at all. In 15th century Castile, noble families like the Manriques controlled entire networks of underground mercury mines, their titles shielding them from prosecution despite poisoning whole valleys with uncontrolled runoff. What made elite participation so brazen was the thin veneer of legitimacy they could apply. A Florentine wool merchant might bribe officials to misplace a few bales from his taxable inventory, then sell them through his own legal shops at premium prices. The Medici archives contain countless such creative bookkeeping entries where smuggled goods reappeared as gifts or inheritance to avoid scrutiny. For the powerful, smuggling wasn't rebellion, it was resource management. This systemic hypocrisy reached its peak in wartime. English nobles during the 100 Years' War publicly decried French wine imports while secretly financing the very ships that smuggled Bordeaux vintages past royal blockades. Their cellar inventories tell the true story: vats marked spoiled, that somehow contained vintages better than the king's own. Even military alliances bent to smuggling's logic. Venetian admirals tasked with intercepting Ottoman arms shipments often let them through after taking their cut. The real scandal wasn't that elites broke the rules, but how thoroughly they wrote them. Many medieval tariffs contained loopholes tailor-made for privileged interests. A famous example is the pilgrim exemption in Mediterranean ports, allowing church-endorsed travelers to import luxury goods tax-free, a system instantly exploited by merchant families who secured fake pilgrimage certificates. Similarly, royal charters granting nobles the right to collect stray goods from their lands became legal cover for fencing stolen merchandise. What emerges is a world where smuggling wasn't an underground economy, but a shadow layer atop the official one. The same counting houses that tracked legitimate trade often managed illicit ledgers in cipher. The notaries who drafted property deeds also forged customs documents. Even kings participated. Henry Roman IV of England financed his rebellion against Richard Roman II partly through smuggled tin revenues from Cornwall. This collusion of power and illegality forces us to reconsider medieval borders not as lines drawn in law, but as elastic boundaries stretched by influence. When a count's wine sailed past a customs post with a wink, when a bishop's wool train avoided inspection by flashing a relic, they weren't just cheating the system, they were proving that authority wasn't monolithic but negotiable. The real map of medieval trade wasn't drawn in ink and parchment, but in favors, fear, and the quiet understanding that some people's laws didn't apply to everyone. Medieval kings faced a dilemma: how to police borders that were more idea than reality. Their solutions ranged from the bureaucratic to the downright theatrical. Take the English system of tumbrels, wooden carts that carried confiscated goods through towns as warnings. The spectacle was meant to terrify would-be smugglers, but records show the same villages kept appearing in court rolls year after year, their illicit trade undiminished. For every smuggler paraded in stocks, a dozen more slipped through the night like shadows. The real workhorses of enforcement were toll collectors stationed at bridges and city gates. These often underpaid officials inspected cargo manifests, probed sacks with iron rods, and even tasted suspicious liquids, yet their success rate was abysmal. A study of 14th century Bordeaux reveals customs officers seized less than 3% of untaxed wine. Why? Because merchants perfected the art of distraction. A flamboyant noble might arrive at a checkpoint with a noisy entourage while his servants quietly unloaded contraband upstream. Some bribed guards with gifts of sample goods. A cask of wine left accidentally at the toll house could ensure future shipments passed untouched. Kings also deployed spies among merchant guilds, but these informants often played both sides. In Genoa, a customs agent named Oberto was caught taking bribes after years of filing glowing reports about his own effectiveness. His ledger, miraculously lost during his trial, later turned up in a Marseille pawnshop, revealing coded entries tracking protection payments from the very smugglers he was paid to catch. Military patrols fared no better. The French crown maintained a special river guard called the Guet de la Seine to intercept tax-dodging barges, but their heavy galleys couldn't match the speed of smugglers' shallow draft boats, which vanished into reed-choked tributaries at the first sign of trouble. In the Alps, border garrisons faced a different problem. Their own survival often depended on black market salt from the communities they were supposed to police. Some rulers embraced pragmatism over principle. The Duke of Burgundy issued letters of tolerance, allowing certain merchants to bypass tolls for a fee. Venetian officials turned blind eyes to Dalmatian smugglers who supplied the city with cheap Balkan grain during famines. Even the famously strict Hanseatic League permitted unofficial trade with rivals when profits outweighed principles. These compromises reveal a hard truth. Medieval states lacked both the resources and the will for total enforcement. A king could build watchtowers along a frontier, but without roads to move troops or couriers to relay warnings, they became expensive follies. The real border wasn't where the king's soldiers stood. It was where his power faded into the landscape, outmaneuvered by those who knew the land's secrets better than any mapmaker. Folklore has a way of turning history's footnotes into legend, and nowhere is that clearer than in the tales woven around smugglers. Take Robin Hood, that iconic outlaw stealing from the rich to give to the poor. While his story is wrapped in myth, the green wood he supposedly haunted Sherwood Forest, was a real smuggling corridor where deer poachers and tax-evading merchants slipped past Norman patrols. The ballads don't just celebrate a hero, they preserve the memory of landscapes that defied control. Every whispered story of secret paths and moonlit rendezvous hints at a deeper truth. Borders were never just lines on a map, but battlegrounds of autonomy. Along the misty coasts of Cornwall, another kind of legend lingers, the ghostly smugglers' lanterns said to flicker above hidden coves. Locals swear these spectral lights mark the routes of long-dead contraband runners, still guiding their illicit cargo ashore. The reality behind the tale: generations of fishermen who doubled as guides, using cleverly placed lanterns to signal safe landing spots, while misleading revenue cutters with decoy fires on the cliffs. The supernatural twist might be fiction, but the defiance it represents was very real. These stories endure because they're more than entertainment. They're oral maps of resistance, passed down like heirlooms. In the Alps, folktales speak of salt witches, mysterious women who could turn into foxes or mist to evade border guards. Historians trace these figures to actual women who dominated the region's smuggling networks, their knowledge of mountain passes rivaling any soldiers. A grandmother might teach her granddaughter to pack salt in hollowed-out loaves or to read the weather signs that meant patrols would stay indoors. By the time these skills became legend, they'd been polished into magic, but the core remained, a testament to the ingenuity of those who outsmarted power. What's fascinating is how these legends often soften the edges of smuggling's danger. The Breton song, La Complainte du Contrebandier, paints a romantic picture of a dashing runner dying in a lover's arms, his final words a vow to meet her in the afterlife. The reality was far grittier. Smugglers drowned in marshes, were crushed under fallen cargo, or rotted in prisons. Yet the folklore transforms their struggles into something noble, a rebuke to the cold machinery of authority. It's no accident that so many of these tales feature clever underdogs outwitting bumbling officials. They're not just stories, they're revenge fantasies against a system that crushed ordinary people under taxes and tolls. Even children's games preserved these memories. In the Pyrenees, kids once played a version of tag called douaniers et contrebandiers, customs officers and smugglers, where the smugglers always won by hiding contraband in imaginary caves. The game's rules mirrored real tactics, distraction, misdirection, and the sheer speed of those who knew the land better than any outsider. Centuries later, the game faded, but the lesson lingered. Borders were something to be played with, not obeyed. The darkest legends, though, are the warnings. Near the Baltic coast, villagers spoke of the toll collector's bride, a spectral figure dragging chains of counterfeit coins. Her origin, likely a real woman executed for helping her smuggler husband bribe officials. These cautionary tales reveal the other side of folklore, not just celebration of resistance, but a reminder of its cost. For every Robin Hood immortalized in song, countless others were broken by the system they challenged. Yet the very existence of these stories is a kind of victory. When a Scottish bard sang of whiskey smugglers outsmarting English redcoats, or a Catalan grandmother recounted how her village hid silk in funeral biers, they were doing more than entertaining. They were keeping alive the idea that power could be questioned, that maps could be redrawn, and that sometimes the most important lines were the ones no king ever put on parchment. The next time you hear an old tale about a shadowy figure slipping through the night, listen closer. Beneath the embellishment, you might just hear the whisper of history's hidden borders and the people who refused to let them be final. Archaeology gives us something official records never could: the physical proof of smuggling's hidden world. Picture a diver pulling a moss-covered chest from a riverbed near old trade routes, its lock rusted shut for centuries. Inside, not gold or jewels, but something far more telling. Dozens of lead seals, the kind once used to certify taxable goods. Each one had been carefully clipped off wool bales, saved like a merchant's receipts for transactions that left no paper trail. This is the tangible side of shadow economies, not just stories, but objects that slipped through the cracks of history and waited silently to be found. Caves tell another layer of this story. In the Dordogne region of France, explorers stumbled upon a cavern where the walls glittered oddly in torchlight. Closer inspection revealed not crystals, but hundreds of tiny mica flakes packing material for delicate Venetian glassware, discarded by smugglers who'd used the cave as a temporary warehouse. Nearby, animal bones bore cut marks from tools, suggesting butchered meals eaten by those waiting for nightfall to move their goods. These aren't just artifacts, they're frozen moments in the daily rhythm of evasion, showing how thoroughly smugglers integrated their work into the landscape. Then there are the deliberate hideaways. Along an alpine pass in Austria, hikers found a crevice stuffed with oilcloth-wrapped bundles, 15th century linen, perfectly preserved by the dry mountain air. But what made this discovery extraordinary was the pattern. Each bolt bore faint chalk marks matching symbols found in ledgers from a Swiss merchant house, evidence of a coordinated system to track untaxed textiles across borders. The linen wasn't lost, it was hidden, likely by a runner who never returned, leaving behind a snapshot of an elaborate underground supply chain. Riverbeds have become accidental archives too. When drought lowered the Po River's waters in 2021, locals spotted strange shapes in the mud, not just the usual wartime debris, but rows of terracotta amphorae deliberately weighted with stones. These weren't shipwrecks, the jars had been sunk individually, their contents olive oil from Liguria long since washed away. Archaeologists realized they'd found a smuggler's trick, submerging cargo to avoid inspections, then retrieving it later with grappling hooks. The river kept its secrets better than any ledger, preserving the methods of those who treated waterways as liquid escape routes. Perhaps most revealing are the small, personal caches. A farmer ploughing near the old Scottish border once turned up a rusted iron box containing silver pennies from 3 different kingdoms: Edwardian English, Robert the Bruce's Scottish, and even a few Irish issues. This wasn't a noble's treasure. The mix of coins, their dates spanning decades, points to a border runner's lifetime savings, hidden where only he knew to find it. The real value isn't in the silver, but in the story it tells, of a man who moved freely across lands supposedly at war, his loyalty measured not by crowns but by profit. These discoveries do more than confirm smuggling existed, they map its invisible geography. Every sunken amphora marks a river crossing patrols missed. Each cave stash reveals a path known only to locals. Even the tiniest finds, like a child's shoe filled with peppercorns found in a Kentish smuggler's tunnel, speak to the human scale of these operations. Archaeology doesn't just uncover objects, it traces the contours of a world that thrived in the margins, where the real borders were never where the kings drew them, but where the land and the people who knew it best allowed passage. History loves to whisper about daring outlaws and shadowy merchants, but it often forgets the quietest conspirators of all, the women who kept smuggling networks alive. While official records fixate on male smugglers hauled before courts, the truth is far more interesting. From the spice routes of Anatolia to the ale trails of England, women weren't just bystanders in the illicit trade, they were its invisible architects. Consider the case of a 14th century English widow named Alice Wade. Tax rolls list her as a humble brewer, but local complaints tell another story of barrels mysteriously vanishing from her cellar only to reappear in neighboring villages, untaxed and under the counter. Alice wasn't an anomaly. She was part of a vast, unspoken sisterhood who turned domestic skills into tools of defiance. The spice markets of medieval Anatolia reveal even bolder strategies. Armenian and Greek women in cities like Trebizond perfected the art of girdle smuggling, stitching precious saffron and pepper into the folds of their voluminous skirts. Ottoman customs officials, forbidden by custom from searching women too thoroughly, could only watch as these walking contraband depots passed through checkpoints untouched. What's remarkable isn't just their ingenuity, but how these networks formalized over time. Some families developed matrilineal smuggling traditions, with grandmothers teaching granddaughters which border guards could be distracted with gifts of sweets and which needed wider berths. Ale smuggling in England shows how women leveraged societal expectations to their advantage. Brewing was considered women's work, a household skill as ordinary as baking bread. But when heavy taxes made homebrewing illegal without a license, entire neighborhoods became complicit in the deception. A housewife might boil her hops in the open, the familiar smell drawing no suspicion, while the real contraband fermented in hidden cellar compartments. Church ales festivals where communities pooled home-made brews often doubled as distribution hubs, with wives and daughters passing jugs hand to hand beneath picnic blankets when tax collectors approached. The Pyrenees tell perhaps the most striking story of female smuggling enterprise. There, the tradition of transhumance seasonal herding between valleys became cover for something far more lucrative. Basque women, left to manage farms while men drove sheep to summer pastures, used their solitude to coordinate wool smuggling operations. They developed a system of laundry signals, specific ways of hanging garments on lines, to alert runners about patrols' movements. By the time officials realized these simple shepherdesses were running intricate networks, the women had already shifted tactics, using funeral processions to hide bales of wool beneath coffins. What makes these stories revolutionary isn't just the breaking of laws, but the shattering of assumptions. Medieval women, often depicted in literature as passive or confined, were in reality navigating geography and bureaucracy with ruthless pragmatism. A Venetian court case from 1432 describes a nun smuggling forbidden books inside hollowed-out loaves of communion bread. In Cologne, guild records complain about wives undercutting official spice prices with contraband supplies. Even aristocratic women participated, like the Countess of Warwick, who used her privileged travel permissions to transport uncustomed French lace disguised as mourning veils. These women didn't just exploit gaps in enforcement, they exploited gaps in perception. Authorities struggling to imagine women as economic actors failed to see the very networks keeping black markets alive. When a Scottish tax collector searched a croft for smuggled whiskey, he might overturn every crate, but would he think to check the baby's swaddling clothes, where a flask nestled against the linen? Would he question why so many pregnant women crossed the border just before market day, only to appear miraculously unburdened on their return? The legacy of these operations lingers in unexpected places. Traditional folk songs from Brittany to the Balkans feature coded verses about the wise women's ways, lyrics historians now recognize as smuggling instructions. Patterns in quilts and embroidery from border regions sometimes mirror trail markers used by contraband runners. Even today, in mountain villages where old smuggling routes have become hiking trails, you'll hear locals speak of grandmother's shortcuts, paths wide enough for a mule but not for a soldier's horse. This hidden history forces us to redraw the map of medieval power yet again, not just along geographic lines but along social ones. Where kings saw subjects divided by gender, smuggling networks saw opportunity. The real borders weren't just between kingdoms, but between what authority thought possible and what people actually did. And in that gap, women moved like shadows, quiet, relentless, and far more powerful than parchment records could ever show. Nature itself conspired with smugglers, offering shifting seasons and unforgiving landscapes that frustrated even the most determined tax collectors. Imagine the frustration of a Habsburg patrol in the dead of winter, watching helplessly as frozen rivers became highways for sleds laden with untaxed Baltic timber routes that vanished come spring thaw. Or picture Venetian galley captains cursing the sudden fog banks that swallowed smuggler boats whole, only for them to reappear miles away, their illicit cargo already changing hands. The land didn't just provide cover, it actively reshaped the game of cat and mouse, giving runners the upper hand. Take the Po River Valley, where spring floods transformed the countryside into a labyrinth of temporary channels. Local smugglers knew which farm tracks would become impassable after rains, forcing customs agents onto predictable main roads, while they pulled flat-bottomed barges through submerged fields, their contraband hidden beneath loads of hay or manure. The same floods that stranded authorities became liquid escape routes for those who understood the water's whims. Over in the Scottish Highlands, autumn brought a different advantage. Herds of red deer migrating through glens provided perfect cover for illicit cattle drives. The thunder of hooves masked the sound of smuggled livestock, while the animals' own trails became highways for untaxed goods. Forests played an even more cunning role. The Black Forest's dense canopy didn't just hide smugglers, it confused pursuers. Merchants developed a system of bent branches and stacked stones to mark paths invisible to outsiders, turning the woods into a living maze. A Bavarian tax collector's report from 1412 complains of chasing shadows. We heard voices ahead, yet found only ravens mocking us from the pines. Meanwhile, in the oak forests of Gascony, resin tappers doubled as lookouts, using their treetop perches to signal patrol movements with flashes of mirrored sunlight. Coastal smugglers exploited lunar cycles like military tacticians. Cornwall's free traders timed runs to coincide with the darkest nights, when neap tides left patrol boats stranded in harbors. They memorized the groan of specific sea caves echoes that changed with water levels, warning of submerged rocks. Some even trained dogs to swim ahead with small loads, their paws silent against the waves. And when storms rolled in, that's when the boldest moves happened. A wrecked ship might accidentally lose barrels of brandy to the surf barrels that conveniently washed ashore where locals waited with carts. The most brilliant adaptations turned geography into psychological warfare. In the marshes of Frisia, smugglers hung lanterns in the reeds to mimic will-o'-the-wisps, luring pursuers into quicksand. Alpine runners spread rumors of avalanche-prone slopes to keep patrols confined to safer and more predictable routes. Even the desert played tricks. Saharan salt caravans buried caches beneath seemingly random dunes, navigating back to them by stars and wind-scoured rock formations unknown to Ottoman mapmakers. These strategies reveal a fundamental truth about medieval power. Control was as much about environmental mastery as legal decree. A king might claim a mountain range, but if his soldiers couldn't survive its blizzards while smugglers moved freely, whose land was it really? The same passes that appeared as blank spaces on royal charts were dotted with cairns and carvings, a shadow map etched by those who truly knew the terrain. Rivers marked as boundaries on parchment might split into a dozen shifting channels in reality, each offering an unpatrolled crossing. The legacy lingers in modern landscapes. Many alpine hiking trails began as smugglers' shortcuts, their gradients carefully calculated for laden mules. The green lanes of England's downs, now beloved by cyclists, once hid contraband beneath their hedgerows. Even the placement of some border towns reflects these old games clustered not where kings drew lines, but where geography gave runners the edge. The next time you see a fog-wrapped forest or a floodplain bursting its banks, remember, these weren't just obstacles to history's powers. They were accomplices to its quiet rebellions. The winding footpaths where medieval smugglers once led their mule trains under cover of darkness now echo with the cheerful chatter of hikers and the crunch of trekking poles. That gentle alpine trail you followed on vacation, there's a good chance it began as a salt runner's secret shortcut, its contours shaped by generations of illicit footsteps. Across Europe and beyond, the ghostly imprint of smuggling networks lingers in modern landscapes, not as forgotten history, but as living infrastructure. The Austrian-Italian border offers a striking example. Today's customs checkpoints follow lines first drawn not by treaties, but by 16th century tobacco smugglers who discovered the least guarded mountain passes. Authorities eventually gave up trying to seal these routes and simply taxed them instead, turning evasion corridors into official crossings. Road engineering tells a similar story. The famous Stelvio Pass in the Italian Alps, with its dizzying switchbacks, traces its origins to medieval wool smugglers who needed gradual inclines for their heavily laden animals. Modern highway planners later adopted these same gradients, proving that even the most advanced engineering sometimes bows to ancient practicality. Along the Scottish-English border, many rural lanes still follow the exact routes of whiskey smugglers, creep roads narrow, hedge-lined tracks that kept illegal stills hidden from excise officers. What began as necessity became tradition, then permanent geography. Political boundaries, too, bear the fingerprints of these underground networks. The jagged border between Spain and Portugal wasn't just shaped by wars and royal marriages. It was influenced by centuries of smuggling communities who treated the frontier as a fluid zone rather than a hard line. Villages like Barrancos became expert at playing both sides, their loyalty measured not by flags but by whichever kingdom offered lower salt taxes that year. When modern borders were finally surveyed, officials often deferred to these existing patterns of movement rather than imposing arbitrary lines. The land itself remembered what parchment ignored. Even maritime borders carry this legacy. The 12-mile limit for national waters, now a standard of international law, originated from the practical range of 18th century coastal cannons. But that distance itself was calibrated to intercept not warships, but smuggling vessels slipping between legal jurisdictions. Modern customs zones still cluster around the same bays and inlets where revenuers once battled free traders, their bureaucratic boundaries echoing old patterns of evasion and enforcement. Perhaps the most surprising survivals are the cultural ones. In the Pyrenees, traditional festivals still feature contrabandista dances celebrating legendary smugglers. Catalan children learn folk songs that once contained coded directions for avoiding patrols. Even cuisine preserves these memories. Portuguese chanfana stew, traditionally made with smuggled goat meat, remains a point of regional pride. These aren't just quaint traditions, they're proof of how thoroughly smuggling shaped local identities in defiance of centralized power, the ultimate irony. Some of Europe's most celebrated trade initiatives unwittingly revived medieval smuggling routes. The EU's cross-border hiking trails often follow ancient contraband paths, their signage now marking what was once deliberately left unmarked. Goods that once moved in shadow Spanish oranges, Dutch cheese, French wine now flow freely along these same corridors, their journey finally legitimized. The smugglers didn't disappear, they won. Their hidden geography became the official one, their pragmatic understanding of terrain and human nature outlasting the rigid systems that tried to contain them. This continuity forces us to reconsider what borders truly are: not lines drawn in moments of political triumph, but slow accumulations of countless human choices. Every time we drive a mountain highway, hike a scenic trail, or cross a modern checkpoint, we're walking in footsteps much older than the nations around us. The land remembers what kingdoms forget, that movement always finds a way, and that the most enduring borders are those that bend to how people actually live, rather than how rulers wish they would. The smuggler threading his way through an alpine pass at midnight would hardly recognize his counterpart in the Sahara, where caravans moved not in darkness but in the blinding light of day, trusting the desert's vastness to swallow their tracks. Yet both were playing the same game, reading landscapes their rulers barely understood. Europe's contraband runners relied on verticality, scaling narrow goat trails where a single misstep could send a mule train tumbling into the abyss. Their Asian counterparts mastered liquidity, slipping through deltas where 100 river channels offered escape routes faster than any patrol boat could follow. And in Africa, there, secrecy wasn't about hiding, it was about endurance. Salt caravans crossed the Tenere Desert in single file, their camels' feet wrapped in rags to muffle sound, navigating by stars and the scars of ancient trade winds on the dunes. Geography dictated tactics with ruthless precision. In the Pyrenees, smugglers exploited microclimates, foggy hollows that blinded pursuers, or south-facing slopes where early snowmelt opened passes weeks ahead of official roadways. Southeast Asia's Mekong Basin presented the opposite challenge: too much water. Here, runners built entire floating villages that could disperse into tributaries at the first sign of authorities, their illicit cargo stashed in false-bottomed fishing boats. The Sahara demanded a different calculus altogether. With no cover to conceal them, Tuareg salt traders turned the desert's emptiness into armor, spacing their caravans miles apart so no single raid could cripple the network. Cultural norms seeped into these strategies like dye into cloth. European runners often disguised themselves as pilgrims, exploiting the church's protections, a ruse unthinkable along the Swahili coast, where Amani customs officials scrutinized how crews for hidden compartments beneath prayer mats. In Ming China, smugglers blended into the bureaucracy itself, bribing mandarins to mislabel cargoes of Japanese silver as tribute goods. Meanwhile, along the Niger River, Songhai merchants used family ties as camouflage, hiding copper ingots in dowry processions where inspectors feared to intrude. The starkest contrast lay in how each region's power structures shaped evasion. Europe's fragmented feudal system created a patchwork of jurisdictions. A smuggler could cross 5 borders in a day, leaving pursuers tangled in legal disputes. Asian empires countered with elaborate paperwork, Korean customs, logs from the Joseon dynasty track individual bolts of smuggled silk down to the thread count, revealing an obsession with control that bred equally meticulous deception. And in Africa, the very concept of borders often clashed with tradition. When Portuguese forts tried to tax the gold trade in 16th century Ghana, Akan merchants simply rerouted through sacred groves where foreign soldiers dared not tread, proving that some lines existed only for outsiders. Yet beneath these differences pulsed a universal truth. No kingdom, no matter how sophisticated, could fully cage commerce. Venetian galley captains smuggling Anatolian grain past Byzantine blockades faced the same core challenge as Malian salt traders evading Songhai tax collectors. Both were navigating the space between what rulers claimed and what they could enforce. A Ming edict banning private overseas trade in 1430 did nothing to stop Fujianese junks laden with porcelain from slipping into the Indian Ocean. They simply flew false flags and paid off coastal garrisons. Similarly, when the Habsburgs tried to seal the Alps against Swiss salt runners, they discovered an inconvenient fact. glaciers make terrible border guards. The legacy of these regional tactics still whispers through modern trade. Alpine smuggling routes became today's scenic hiking trails, their gradients now admired rather than feared. The Mekong's labyrinthine channels now host tourist cruises where once contraband flowed. Even the Sahara's ancient salt roads endure as UNESCO heritage trails, their dangers tamed, their secrets made picturesque. But the lesson remains: look beyond the official maps and you'll find the real ones, etched not in ink but in the stubborn patterns of human movement. The borders that mattered were never the ones drawn in palaces, but those worn into the earth by countless footsteps refusing to be stopped. The year was 1347, when a Genoese trading post on the Crimean coast became ground zero for a catastrophe no smuggler could have foreseen. As Mongol forces besieged the port, they catapulted plague-ridden corpses over the walls, a gruesome act of biological warfare. But the real devastation came later, when a handful of ships slipped past the blockade carrying more than just silks and spices. Stowed away in their cargo holds and clinging to the fur of black rats were fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that would ignite the Black Death. These vessels didn't just transport goods, they became unwitting vectors of the deadliest pandemic in human history, proving how smuggling networks could turn border fluidity from an economic advantage into a lethal liability. Quarantine laws emerged as desperate measures to stem the tide. Venice pioneered the 40-day isolation period, the quarantina, requiring ships to anchor offshore before unloading. But just as with tax evasion, smugglers found ways around these restrictions. In Marseille, merchants bribed officials to certify clean bills of health for contaminated vessels, while in Bristol, fishermen ran midnight operations to unload cargo from supposedly sequestered ships. The very routes that had once moved border wine past customs now carried something far more dangerous: infected wool bales from Flanders, flea-infested grain sacks from Sicily, even second-hand clothing stripped from plague victims in Lombardy. What good were border controls when desperation and profit motives conspired to circumvent them? The plague spread through these underground channels exposes a chilling paradox of medieval globalization. Official trade routes at least had some semblance of oversight. Merchants might disinfect goods with vinegar or burn aromatic herbs as primitive sanitizers. But contraband moved in the shadows, bypassing even these feeble precautions. A smuggler's shortcut through the Alps could introduce the pestilence to isolated valleys months ahead of its expected trajectory. In 1440, when England tried to ban Italian silk imports to prevent reinfection, the price of black market velvet soared, and with them the risk of undetected carriers. The disease didn't discriminate between legitimate and illicit trade. It thrived wherever human movement outpaced regulation. Some communities learned brutal lessons about the cost of porous borders. The village of Iam in England famously quarantined itself during an outbreak, but most places lacked such discipline. Scottish whiskey smugglers brought the plague across the border despite wartime hostilities, while Hanseatic merchants spread it through Baltic ports by disguising infected ships as herring fleets. Even religious pilgrimages became super-spreader events, as fake pilgrims used holy travel permits to move freely through infected zones. The same networks that once spirited salt past watchtowers now delivered death to doorsteps. Yet this tragedy also birthed unexpected innovations. The Venetian Republic's lazaretto's isolated island hospitals evolved into sophisticated quarantine stations with separate wards for observation and disinfection. Customs officials began inspecting not just goods but the health of crews, giving rise to early public health protocols. In Dubrovnik, officials invented the first health passports, precursors to modern vaccination records. These weren't just bureaucratic exercises, they were hard-won realizations that borders needed to regulate biology as well as commerce. The Black Death's journey along smuggling routes forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth: interconnectedness always carries risk. Those medieval merchants dodging quarantine didn't intend to spread plague, they were simply following the same profit motives that had always guided them. But their actions reveal how easily shadow economies can amplify larger crises, turning local outbreaks into continental catastrophes. The same mountain passes that once carried contraband salt now bore invisible cargoes far more destabilizing, proving that borders aren't just lines on maps, they's the fragile membranes separating survival from disaster. 5 centuries later, as modern pandemics continue to exploit global trade networks, the lesson remains eerily relevant. When everything flows, so does everything else. To call smuggling simply crime ignores the lived reality of medieval peasants for whom a single tax could mean the difference between feeding their children or starvation. Picture a Breton fisherman's widow fined into destitution by the French crown's salt monopoly, who turns to smuggling not out of greed, but because the sea offers her family's only lifeline. Communities across Europe celebrated such figures in folk songs and secret toasts not as lawbreakers, but as local heroes who outmaneuvered distant rulers deaf to their suffering. In the Scottish Highlands, where English wool tariffs crushed local weavers, illicit traders were called the people's merchants, their midnight runs celebrated with coded ballads warning of excise patrols. This moral gray zone becomes even clearer when examining what was smuggled. Salt and grain weren't luxuries, they were survival. During the Great Famine of 1315, when English authorities continued exporting scarce wheat for profit, Cornish villages survived only through clandestine networks importing Breton flour. Was breaking the law here criminal or moral? Even medieval courts wrestled with this dilemma. Records from Burgundy showed judges acquitting bread smugglers during shortages, while in Aragon, customs officers were known to lose count of olive oil barrels when facing starving crowds. The line between villain and savior depended entirely on whose ox was being gored. Yet smuggling wasn't always altruistic. The same Alpine passes that carried life-saving salt also transported stolen relics and forged documents. Wealthy merchants exploited underground routes to dodge taxes on silks and spices, padding their fortunes while peasants bore the brunt of enforcement. In bustling ports like Genoa, smuggling syndicates operated with near impunity, their connections to powerful families ensuring protection. This duality forces us to ask, when does resistance become exploitation? The Venetian glassblower sneaking uncustomed mirrors to Egypt might be struggling to feed his family, but the nobleman financing the operation is simply increasing his margins. Religious authorities added another layer of complexity. While the church condemned smuggling as theft, many monasteries actively participated, like the Cistercians of Clairvaux, who bypassed wine taxes using their clerical immunity to move barrels. In Spain, Jewish and Muslim smugglers fleeing persecution became folk heroes among their people, even as Christian kings branded them outlaws. The same act could be sin or salvation, depending on who told the tale. Modern parallels abound. Just as medieval peasants saw smugglers as checkers on oppressive rulers, today's informal economies, from Cuban black markets to unlicensed street vendors, often draw public sympathy as resistance to unaffordable regulations. The core tension remains unchanged. When does defiance of unjust systems become morally justified? a 14th century wool runner dodging English tariffs to keep his village clothed isn't so different from a modern family importing life-saving medicines across borders priced beyond reach. Perhaps the most telling evidence comes from the smugglers themselves. Interrogation records from French salt trials reveal prisoners justifying their actions not with excuses, but with defiance. The king owns the land, but not the sweat of our brows. In the end, these hidden networks held up a mirror to power, exposing the hypocrisy of rulers who criminalized survival while exempting their own excesses. The real crime wasn't the evasion, it was the systems that made evasion necessary. Hollowed-out loaves of bread, mules with false saddlebags, even dogs trained to carry tiny flasks of contraband whiskey. The smuggler's toolbox was as ingenious as it was varied. Consider the humble wine barrel, a staple of medieval trade. To the untrained eye, it held nothing but fermented grapes, but smugglers transformed these everyday objects into masterpieces of deception. Some featured false bottoms, creating hidden compartments for spices or silks. Others had carefully constructed inner linings that could hold precious metals without altering the barrel's outward appearance. In coastal regions, fishermen weighted barrels and sunk them just offshore, marked with buoys disguised as flotsam, ready to be retrieved under cover of darkness. These adaptations weren't just clever, they were necessities, born from the constant pressure to stay one step ahead of increasingly suspicious authorities. Animals played unexpected roles in these operations. Along the Scottish border, terriers were bred small enough to scramble through narrow tunnels with leather pouches strapped to their backs, delivering illicit goods from hidden stills to waiting buyers. In the Alps, goats became living contraband carriers that were woven with pockets to hold salt cakes, blending seamlessly into legitimate herding routes. Even birds entered the game. Falconers in the Holy Roman Empire were caught using their birds to transport small packets of saffron across castle walls, exploiting a loophole that exempted hunting birds from search protocols. The creativity extended to the animal kingdom because, unlike humans, animals couldn't be interrogated. Geography itself became a tool. Smugglers in marshlands like the English fens used the landscape as both shield and disguise. Flat-bottomed punts glided silently through reeds, their cargo hidden beneath layers of freshly cut sedge, a common roofing material that drew no suspicion. In mountainous regions, runners exploited natural echoes, whistling specific sequences to communicate across valleys without risking written messages. The caves of the Dordogne served as natural warehouses, their entrances concealed by carefully arranged vines, while underground rivers in the Carpathians allowed goods to be floated through darkness, bypassing patrols entirely. The most audacious tactics involved psychological manipulation. In Brittany, smugglers spread rumors of haunted coves to keep officials away from their landing spots, even staging ghostly lights with strategically placed lanterns. Venetian merchants perfected the art of the decoy, sending a heavily guarded but legally clean ship through customs, while a second, unmarked vessel slipped into port unnoticed. Along the Rhine, wine traders exploited religious reverence by hiding contraband in coffins during funeral processions, counting on the superstition of inspectors to avoid searching the dead. These innovations weren't just about hiding goods, they reflected a deeper understanding of medieval surveillance's weaknesses. Without fingerprints, forensic science, or reliable record-keeping, authorities relied heavily on visual inspection and local informants. Smugglers turned these limitations against them. A trader might openly declare part of his cargo, knowing inspectors would focus on the obvious while missing the carefully concealed remainder. Others exploited language barriers, pretending not to understand questions while their hidden goods sat in plain sight, disguised as something innocuous. The constant evolution of these methods created a self-perpetuating cycle. Every new detection technique sparked an even cleverer evasion. When customs officers began using iron rods to probe wool bales for hidden compartments, smugglers responded by packing goods in loose layers that slipped around the probes. When ports started requiring detailed manifests, merchants invented cipher systems to hide true contents in plain text. Even the introduction of tollgate spies was met with counterintelligence smugglers planting false rumors to send authorities chasing phantom caravans while the real goods moved elsewhere. What's fascinating isn't just the variety of these tactics, but their regional specialization. Alpine smugglers prioritized portability, collapsible sleds for snow, foldable rafts for rivers. Coastal runners focused on timing, synchronizing operations with tides and moon phases. Desert caravans minimized sound, wrapping camel hooves in cloth and using sand-smooth containers that left no distinctive marks. Each environment demanded and inspired its own unique solutions, proving that smuggling wasn't a monolithic trade but a series of localized arts refined through generations. The legacy of these innovations lingers in unexpected places. Modern customs techniques like X-rays and sniffer dogs evolved directly from medieval counter-smuggling efforts. Even the concept of profiling has roots in this era, as authorities tried, and often failed, to identify runners based on dress, dialect, or behavior. The cat and mouse game shaped both law enforcement and criminal ingenuity in ways that still echo today, a testament to the enduring power of human creativity when faced with constraints. The next time you see a shipping container or a border checkpoint, remember the dance between concealment and detection began not with modern technology, but in the minds of those medieval runners who looked at a barrel, a loaf of bread, or even a dog, and saw possibilities no lawmaker could anticipate. War turned borders into illusions and smugglers into the shadow quartermasters of history. When armies clashed and kings drew battle lines, these covert operators wove their own web of connections across enemy territories. Take the siege of Calais in 1346. While English and French forces starved each other into submission, Dutch fishing boats slipped through naval blockades carrying sacks of Flemish grain. They didn't care which crown claimed the port. They knew hungry soldiers would pay double for bread, regardless of the flag they fought under. These wartime networks didn't just defy blockades, they exposed how quickly political divisions crumbled when survival was at stake. The mechanics of wartime smuggling reveal astonishing ingenuity. During the 100 Years' War, Bordeaux wine merchants repurposed ecclesiastical networks, hiding barrels in shipments of communion wine that even the most devout customs officers hesitated to search. In the Baltic, Hanseatic traders exploited truce days, officially sanctioned pauses in fighting, to move timber and grain between warring Teutonic and Polish forces. The most audacious operated right under generals' noses. Florentine bankers financing both sides of the Italian wars used armored money wagons to smuggle saltpeter for gunpowder, their legitimate cargo passes shielding illegal deliveries that prolonged conflicts. Besieged cities became smuggling's ultimate proving grounds. When Ottoman troops encircled Vienna in 1529, the city's survival hinged on Serbian merchants who knew secret paths through the Wienerwald forests. Their donkey trains carried not just food but intelligence. Each bale of hay hollowed out to hold maps of Turkish positions. Centuries later, during Napoleon's continental blockade, Heligoland Island became a glittering hub of British smugglers funneling colonial sugar and coffee into Europe. The tiny sandbars warehouses overflowed with contraband, proving that no embargo could outmaneuver human cunning. What's most revealing is how wartime smuggling redrew alliances. English wool traders, officially barred from dealing with France, quietly supplied both sides through Flemish middlemen. Venetian arms dealers sold identical cannons to Christian and Ottoman fleets, sometimes in the same year, by routing shipments through neutral Ragusa. Even religion faltered as a barrier. Jewish spice merchants in Granada maintained trade with both Muslim and Christian armies during the Reconquista, their networks transcending holy wars. These weren't just business decisions, they were live demonstrations of how commerce ignored the artificial lines drawn by sword strokes. The aftermath often proved more telling than the smuggling itself. Post-war tax records from border regions consistently show missing goods that mysteriously reappeared in markets once hostilities ceased. In Nuremberg after the 30 Years' War, officials discovered entire neighborhoods built with untaxed timber floated down the Pegnitz River during the chaos. The Rhine Valley's post-war wine glut wasn't from new harvests, but from thousands of hidden barrels emerging from caves and false-bottomed barns. Wars didn't just disrupt trade, they forced it underground where it developed its own rules and routes. Military archives preserve the frustrated accounts of commanders helpless against this shadow economy. The Duke of Alba's letters from the Dutch revolt complain of peasants who know every ditch smuggling arms to rebels. English naval logs from the Napoleonic Wars detail chasing phantom ships that vanished into Scandinavian fjords with holds full of Indian cotton. These weren't mere anecdotes, they were admissions that no siegeworks could contain the collective ingenuity of those determined to move goods. The ultimate irony, many wartime smuggling routes became peacetime trade arteries. The goat tracks used to bypass Spanish blockades in the Pyrenees later became official toll roads. The nighttime fishing boat runs between Dover and Calais evolved into licensed packet services. Even the underground tunnels rebels dug beneath city walls were repurposed as legitimate smuggling cellars because once crisis passes, what rulers call treason often gets rebranded as enterprise. The real borders weren't where the army stood, but where the last smuggler turned to wink at the sentries before melting into the fog. The tightening grip of royal authority didn't so much erase smuggling as force it to evolve. By the 16th century, kings who once struggled to control their own castles now commanded standing armies and professional tax bureaus. Paved roads, once rare enough that smugglers could avoid them entirely, now spiderwebbed across Europe, each one a potential artery for patrols. But like water finding cracks in stone, illicit trade simply adapted. Consider the case of the French gabelle, the notoriously hated salt tax. As Louis Roman XIV inspectors tightened controls on major highways, runners shifted to Kemen's Crew holloways, those sunken lanes worn deep by centuries of hooves and cartwheels. These natural trenches, overgrown with hawthorn and bramble, became the new smuggling superhighways, invisible from the king's newly built roads just yards away. Centralized tax systems posed another challenge. Gone were the days when a merchant could exploit gaps between a dozen local tolls. Now, national customs houses kept meticulous ledgers and employed mathematicians to sniff out discrepancies. Yet human nature remained the system's weakest link. Spanish tobacco smugglers in the 1700s discovered that corrupting a single clerk in Seville's Casa de Contratación could falsify entire shipments as bound for the colonies, only to be lost back into European markets. The Dutch took a different approach, using their legal re-export trade to launder contraband. Spices arriving in Amsterdam from the East Indies would magically gain Portuguese paperwork before slipping into France. The stronger the state, the more creative the circumvention. Professional armies should have been the death knell for smuggling's golden age. No longer could a band of armed merchants bully their way past a feudal lord's half-hearted guards. But soldiers, it turned out, were just as susceptible to bribery as their predecessors, and often more so. English excise officers in the Scottish Highlands reported entire regiments turning blind eyes to whiskey stills for a share of the profits. Along the Austro-Ottoman frontier, border garrisons famously supplemented their meager pay by taxing the very smugglers they were meant to arrest, creating a shadow toll system more efficient than the official one. What's fascinating is how this struggle reshaped both smugglers and states. The rise of passports and customs declarations didn't eliminate clandestine trade, it birthed the forger's art. Improved ship design led to faster customs cutters, but also to sleeker smuggling vessels like the British hovering luggers, which could outrun anything with sails. Even the printing press, that great tool of state bureaucracy, was turned against its masters, producing counterfeit tax stamps nearly indistinguishable from real ones. The real shift wasn't the end of smuggling, but its transformation from a fact of daily life into a specialized criminal enterprise. Where medieval peasants once casually avoided taxes as part of seasonal routines, early modern smuggling required organization and protection. The infamous Hawkhurst gang of 18th century England operated like a corporation, with investors, payrolls, and even legal defense funds for arrested members. Similarly, the Camorra in Naples began as a network of tobacco smugglers before evolving into something far darker. Yet for all these changes, some things remained constant. Remote valleys still hid their secrets, fishermen still knew the safest coves, and border communities still valued loyalty to neighbors over distant kings. The last smugglers' trails didn't vanish, they faded into hiking paths, their stories preserved in local festivals and faded tavern signs. The state may have won the battle of maps and ledgers, but the land itself never forgot its old, defiant rhythms. Smugglers' routes whisper a truth that official records dared not speak. Power was never absolute, only ever negotiated. Those winding mountain trails and moonlit coves weren't just bypasses around authority. They were proof that kingdoms lived or died by the consent of the people who moved through them. Think of the Alpine herder guiding his mule train along a cliffside path no tax collector would dare follow, or the Venetian merchant counting coins in a shadowed warehouse while the Doge's officials patrolled the brightly lit docks. These weren't exceptions to the medieval world. They were the medieval world, its pulse measured not in royal decrees but in the quiet defiance of everyday survival. What makes these hidden paths so revealing is how they expose the illusion of control. A king might commission a map with bold colors marking his domains, but the real borders were written in footsteps: the smuggler's detour around a toll house, the fisherman's pre-dawn run past a customs galley, the widow selling untaxed salt from her cottage with a wink to the village bailiff. These weren't cracks in the system, they were the system's shadow counterpart, where loyalty was measured in barter, not oaths. When a Castilian shepherd traded Aragonese wool under the table, or a Flemish weaver bought English fleece from a midnight rowboat, they weren't just breaking rules. They were rewriting them. The legacy lingers in ways we seldom notice. Modern highways often trace the contours of old smuggling routes, their gentle gradients originally plotted for laden mules, not trucks. Village festivals from Cornwall to Transylvania still reenact contrabandist chases, turning historical resistance into communal celebration. Even our language carries echoes: off the books, under the table, through the back door, all phrases born from the ingenuity of those who refused to be fenced in. So the next time you unfold a medieval map, look beyond the inked borders and ornate crests. The real story lies in the blank spaces between the lines, in the valleys where no toll booth stood, the coastline where no ships patrolled, the forests where footfalls left no records. These were the places where history's quiet rebels proved a timeless lesson. No wall is unclimbable, no law unbreakable, and no border so fixed that human creativity can't find a way through. Thanks for wandering these shadowed trails with me. If you enjoyed unearthing history's hidden corridors, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your favorite smuggling stories in the comments below.